Hey, has anyone here ever built an application where they stored a password in plain text in a database? Yeah. There's always a few people that admit it. I'm sure there's a lot more. So I've done it in the past, obviously not in production applications, but we tend to do it sometimes because as developers, we get very excited about stuff. We get very excited. We have an idea. We want to build something. We just want to jump into it. I want to build the new Uber of whatever. So you just kind of jump into the code and then, I got to build a login form. So you build that. And then, I need a sign-up form. So you build the sign-up form and, users, they'll lose their password. So you need a forgot password form. And then next thing you know, you're 2 weeks into your project and you haven't started anything. You just have like all the sign-up process. I have a few GitHub repos that are basically just a sign-up process with no actual code, because after 2 weeks, I'm bored and I don't want to do my project anymore. So sometimes we do that. And to help me with that, at one point, I decided to look a little bit into different alternatives to building my own username and password authentication each and every time I was building an application. So I started looking into OAuth. And there's a lot of charts and a lot of arrows and a lot of redirects, and I didn't quite understand what was going on. So I went back to storing username and passwords in plain text in my database. But recently I joined a company called Auth0, and basically the product is OAuth as a service. So they have an identity management platform as a service. So I kind of had to learn a little bit about it. So, and ever since I kind of started to look into this OAuth stuff and this whole token-based authentication stuff, I was like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about OAuth. I'm going to talk about OpenID Connect. We're going to see how those things work. So like I said, a little bit about me. I'm Canadian, as you might have noticed. I'm a proud Canadian. I also always wear this hoodie because I don't want people to mistake me for an American. So I'm French-Canadian also, so that's the little accent there. If you ever want to contact me, Twitter is always the best way. Whenever I get a Twitter notification, I get super excited. So if you ever have a question or something, just feel free to send me a note there. Like I said, I joined Auth0 recently, and I'm a technical evangelist for them, which basically means that I get to read about stuff, learn about new stuff, a lot of stuff regarding authentication and authorization. And I then go to conferences and I share that information and I try to make it as simple as possible. And because of that job, I get to travel a lot. So I go to all of those different places, and it seems like a very glamorous job, right? Travel all the time, go to all those fancy restaurants. And back home, I'm a little bit of a foodie. I really like good food. Actually, some of my very close friends, or one of my very close friends, is a professional chef. So there's always like this fancy food. So their vision of me traveling all around the world is like usually like this. While in reality, I usually just like run from place to place, have a lot of meetup food, gain a lot of weight. So I'll go and try to find a place to grab a quick bite before I'm heading somewhere else. And in those restaurants, there's a little bit of a difference between those fancy places, is that they'll usually ask you to pay in advance, right? So you'll go in, you'll pay, and then they'll serve you. And because I travel, once again, I don't necessarily want to use or have cash with me all the time. It just gets complicated, so I'll usually use my credit card. But those restaurants, they don't know what to do with a credit card. I mean, obviously, they're not going to, build a system to get information out or get money out of your bank account. So they need something else. They need this little machine to help you. So what this little machine does is that when you go in, you ask for a slice of pizza. They give you this machine, and this machine will delegate the access to your bank account. So it will basically tell the restaurant, yeah, he's good, he has that money, and we authorize the payment to go through, so at the end of the day, you will get the money from his bank account. And then they're able to serve my pizza. And really, that's what OAuth is all about. So very simply, it's basically just a browser application that tries to access an API, and when you try to connect, it will check if you're authenticated or not, And if not, they'll redirect you to another server to validate if you are who you are and if you have access to a specific resource. If you do, the server will tell the API that you actually have access to it and will serve it back to the browser. But why would you do that? OAuth is a lot about delegation. So delegation delegation the right to have access to a specific resource, but also delegating all of that stuff related to the user management or the identity management of the user to its own server. I come from the PHP world. That's what I used to do up until maybe 8 or 9 years ago when I finally saw the light and I moved to JavaScript, which I don't know if it's really better, but anyways. But I used to do a lot of PHP. And when you did PHP, the traditional way to do an application or to do your login form was to have something like this. So your server would do a request to a login.php page. And the server obviously would send back the page. And then the user would fill in their information, fill in their credentials. You would send that to the server. They'd go check on your database, ideally with stuff that is encrypted, not in plain text. If the user is found, you get an OK and return a cookie to the browser. Now, that cookie would represent a session that was open on the server. It's just an ID to map to that session that is open that says, yes, this user is authenticated and so on. But in a world of stateless and RESTful APIs, there's a few things that don't work very well with this type of schema. First of all, there's so many different ways to access applications now and to access the data that is provided by your APIs. I mean, obviously, there's the traditional web application. Sometimes you'll be able to build a responsive application, but sometimes somebody will want a native application. So if you have a native application, it gets a little bit trickier to use that login.php page. And if you have machine-to-machine communication, it's even harder. The other machine doesn't know what to do with that login form. With conversational APIs, it gets like a nightmare. So there's a lot of different ways to access APIs now. Another problem that I had a lot when I was building PHP applications was that code would get really messy really quickly. As much as you try to keep everything very good and very separated, your code tended to be a little bit tightly coupled. So you had a lot of stuff in your APIs that would depend on the state of the user. So there's a lot of stateful connection. Now, if you had to build a new application, you had to basically start from scratch. And that's not very good for the image of your company, especially if your users know that those two websites come from the same company, but you have to create it and you have to use a different login. It's a little bit tricky. If you're lucky, you might be able to use the same database so that users don't have to create a new account. But most of the time, it was actually a new database as well. So it was kind of tricky to have this completely new application with a new sign-up process for users that knew that those two websites came from the same company. Also, if you needed to access another API or another machine and do something on behalf of the user. Now, I remember many years ago, the good way to do that would be to store the user's credentials in your database for this other resource. So you wanted to do something to post something on MySpace. So we would ask the user, what's your username and password for MySpace? You would store that in plain text, of course, in your database because you needed to access it later on. And then you would be very careful about encrypting the password for your website, which didn't make a lot of sense, right? So yeah, that obviously doesn't work. And that's a reason for a lot of breaches. And finally, users have so many different user accounts already. When I joined Auth0 just a few months ago, I actually had to install a password manager. It's one of our policies. All of the employees need to use a password manager. And I looked at it just before my talk, and I have 189 different user accounts in there, all with different randomly generated passwords. I mean, I consider myself kind of a smart person, but there's no way I can remember 200 different randomly generated passwords. There's no way in hell. So users already have all of those different accounts, and that's why they're kind of reusing the same passwords over and over. So that's a security concern, obviously. But also for that reason, users just don't want to sign up anymore. So there's a lot of websites. And one example that I keep thinking about is Medium. Like, I just want to go there, read the blog article, and get out. I don't want to create an account for that website, but it keeps annoying me and telling me, do you want to create an account? I'm like, no, I have enough accounts already. So asking for a user to sign up and they'll do all that process can actually hurt your conversion rates. And for all of those reasons, OAuth will come and help us a little bit. Like I said, there's no way to go around OAuth without going through those charts, those arrows, those redirects. But I'll try to keep it as simple as I can. So there are many, many different flows that are explained in the OAuth protocol, OAuth framework. And OAuth is just kind of a way that describes all the different ways to log into your application and to carry around the information related to the authorization. One of the flows that is often used is the authorization code flow, and it looks a little bit like this. Like I said, I moved to JS recently, so I'm using mostly JavaScript examples. But you have something like this. You have a server that will serve your web pages and take care of the user connection, and you have an API as well that has some of the data that you want to access. So your client will try to access that server. It will detect if you're authorized or if you're logged in or not. And if you're not logged in, it will redirect you to the authorization server. Now, this redirect part is really important. You really redirect the user to that other machine completely, and you can really focus and make sure that this machine is as secure as it gets. If there's any patches and all that stuff, those need to be applied on that authorization server. So you really redirect the user there. And it's that server's responsibility to authenticate the user. So it could be a login form, but it could be many different things. It could be passwordless authentication. It could use YubiKeys. It could use email links. There's many, many different ways to do authentication nowadays. And actually, you should probably look into different things than username and password, because those are getting a little bit obsolete, but that's a whole completely different subject. So it's really the authorization server's responsibility to do that. And by delegating that here, if you ever need to change the authentication mechanism later on down the road, it's easy because you only have to focus on this area. Once you're authenticated, the authorization server will send back an access code to your browser. That access code is a short string, and it has a timeline, a life cycle, and it's very, very short-lived. So it will expire very quickly, but you send that to the server, and the server will take that code and do a request to the authorization server to get an access token and a refresh token. I'll come back to exactly what a token is in a few minutes, but the important part here is that your application, that the web app that you've built, your front end, never had access to the user's credentials, never have access to the access token, never has access to anything that has to do with the users. So by doing so, you're kind of all pushing that in the back, and you don't have to worry with that in your front end. So now that your server has an access token, it can actually go make some requests on the API, and it will return the data. Another flow that is often used, especially if you build single-page applications, if you're doing a React application that accesses directly an API. There's a way to do it. It's not as secure, so the access code flow is a little bit more secure. It's the one that you should typically use. There's also the hybrid flow that was presented a little bit earlier today, but I'll focus on the implicit flow here. And the implicit flow is pretty much the same thing, but the only difference is that it's your browser that will be responsible of validating if the user is logged in, and if he's not, the browser will redirect to the authorization server. Then we do the same thing. The authorization server will take care of validating who the user is. If that's the case, we get an access token back. And now the browser can use that access token to get access to the API. The big difference here is that we don't have a refresh token. and that your browser now has an access token. So if anybody gets a hold of that access token through a man-in-the-middle attack or different things, he can actually impersonate you. So that's one of the reasons why it's a little bit less secure. So I've talked about tokens, but what's a token? And I most specifically talked about two different types of token here, access tokens and refresh tokens. An access token is just, simply put, a key to access resources on an API. Using an access token, you can say, I am authorized to, or the access token will specify that you are authorized to access resource X, and the API, knowing that, will actually serve you back the data. So it acts like a key to your API. They're very short-lived, typically, but then it depends. Most of the security stuff is never black or white, right? It's always in the gray spectrum. If you have an application, a banking application, for example, you'll probably want to make sure that this token is very short-lived. You know, just in a few minutes, you should expire it, because you don't want somebody else to actually be able to grab that token and impersonate you, because that's very sensitive data. You don't want to give anyone access to your bank account, accidentally, at least. Now, on the other side, there's the refresh token. Oh, and back to the life cycles, sorry, the duration of the tokens. Sometimes you will actually want to keep it longer lived. So if you have, say, you have an application that is used by office workers, and there's not a lot of sensitive information there, maybe you want to keep it like for 8 hours so that the users don't have to log in the middle of the day at 10 different times in the middle of the day, right? So you'll want to keep them maybe a little bit longer lived. So it really depends on the type of application that you're building. It's really up to you. It's always a balance between security and user experience. But if you want to build longer-lived tokens, you'll probably want to make sure that you have a flow that incorporates refresh tokens. A refresh token lets you get a new token, a new access token, and they're very long-lived. So it could go anywhere from days to months to years. So why not just make longer-lived access tokens, right? It's the same thing. If a refresh token lets me get new access tokens, then why would I make longer-lived refresh tokens? The main reason for that is that refresh tokens can be revoked at any time by the user. This is the screen from Google. So you can see all the applications that you connected with. Whenever you do sign in with Google, you can go into Google settings. I can't remember exactly how you access it. But you see you have here my Duolingo, because I really tried to learn German, but I'm so bad at it. I know about like 200 words or something. But seriously, though, you have all the applications for which you've used sign in with Google. This is the screen for GitHub, which is basically the same thing. And you can see here that you have a revoke button for each one of those. So if you revoke access, the next time that you'll try to log in, it will ask you to log in again because you've revoked that token, so they cannot create new access tokens. Tokens can take multiple forms. A token is simply a piece of digital information that is used to share information between two machines. So it could be, there's something in the WS world. You can use SAML as a token as well. Really, nothing is defined in a spec regarding the actual token. You could build your own custom stuff if you'd like. I think SAP has their own type of tokens. But I'm going to focus on JWTs here. And on the topic of JWTs, there's this big controversy in the security world. It's a bit of a boring world, right? Security. So we fight about like things that have absolutely no sense. Whether it's called JWT or JOT, I'm a big fan of JWT. There's no O in there. I refuse to call it the JOT, but some people will actually tell you that it's a JOT. Sorry about that. So I'm a big fan of the JWT. It's kind of like this whole GIF thing all over again. But seriously, though, JSON Web Tokens, or JWTs, are something like this. So it's basically just it has three different parts, right? So it has a header. it has a payload and a signature. So the header will contain information about the JSON Web Token itself. We'll say, well, I'm of type JWT, and I'll be using algorithm HS256 for the signature. That's the most basic one that you could have. Not a lot of things there. As a side note, HMAC 256 is probably not the best algorithm to use. It can actually be brute forced if you don't use secret keys that are long enough. But that's just a side note. So yeah, that's the header information. It tells you what this JSON Web Token is, and it's just a JSON object. Now the payload could be just about anything. There's a few reserved keywords or a few reserved keys. Sub is one of them, which is typically the user ID that is for which this token is meant for. Sorry. There's a few of them. ISS is another one, which specifies the issuer, so who issued this token. AUD is the audience, so who is this token meant for? And all of those can be used to increase the security of your JSON Web Token, to put more places where you can validate, is this an actual valid token? But you could put anything in here. I'm putting the name. I'm putting a scope here, which is just permissions. Scopes are used very loosely. There's a bunch of different ways to use it. Once again, it's not specified in the standards, but often you'll see something like a resource and then the permission that you have. So post and read, post and write, if you had a blog platform here. And finally, you have a signature. So the signature will take all those two different components and hash them with an algorithm that is specified in the header, and you will generate a signature based on either a secret key or a public-private key pair. So there's a few different ways to validate the signature, to create a signature. The signature is very important because that's the part that will actually validate or prevent anybody from tampering with that JSON Web Token. So if you change anything in here, the signature won't match because it's actually using those two parts to create the signature. So you take all of those things, base64 encode all of them, concatenate everything using dots, and you've got your JSON Web Token. Very lightweight. Very easy to carry around. So that's what you have. There's a question in the back? There are ways to encrypt it. It's different ways. Like I said, the tokens themselves can be anything. So you could encrypt a token, or you could build a token that is encrypted. But JSON Web Tokens, by nature, are not encrypted. And we can see it right here. So if you ever have to play with authorization servers and tokens, this really nice tool, jwt.io, lets you just paste in the content of your JSON Web Token to the left, and to the right, you've got the decoded token. So JSON Web Token, by the spec, is not encrypted. So all of the information, if anybody gets a hold of your JSON Web Token, they can see all of the information in there. It's very easy to see it because it's just base64 encoded. So that was exactly my point. Actually, as you can see, I have on the right all the information of the payload. So make sure that you never put any sensitive information as part of a JSON Web Token. So that's very, very important. Always keep in mind that JSON Web Tokens are basically just plain text. So let's just look at a little bit of code now. Anybody Node.js developer? All right. Well, I'm sorry, it's Node.js code. So I just wanted to go through how to create like a basic, very, very basic authorization server, as well as an API that is secured. And I kind of show you that. I'll go through slowly, but the code is fairly straightforward. So there's nothing very, very complex here. So even if you're not a Node developer, you should be good. So one of the things that you'll do whenever you build a Node application or Node service, that you'll start requiring all the different libraries that you need. Express is a server, basically a web server that you can use. Very, very nice one to use if you ever have to build a Node.js server. Body parser will let me parse a response or the message that I got from the browsers. And I will use a library. Now, while it's very easy to decode your own JSON Web Tokens, there's a lot of different pitfalls. So if you ever need to deal with JSON Web Tokens, either to create them or to read them, decode them, I recommend that you use a library that has made its ways in. And then you just instantiate your Express server, so you start the server. Now you'll need the user database. So I'll just have a list of users here. I'll keep everything in memory just for the sake of having a small and easy demo. And of course, I will put my passwords in plain text right there, because, yeah, why not? And then you define all the different routes for your servers. So for my authorization server, the important route will be a post route to the /login endpoint. So this will be accessed by using a post request to authorization server /login. And then I'll just have a catch-all for all of the different URLs, or every other request, I'll just send a 404 for everything else. Now back to my login endpoint. What I'll do here is very, very simple. And once again, it's just more for demo purposes. So, I mean, it's definitely not very secure. So don't use this in production. But what you'll try to do is validate that the request is valid. So there's a username, there's a password that were actually part of the request. If so, then you'll search for users. So you'll go through your database, try to find a match. See how easy it is to use plain text passwords? I mean, you should. So you can validate, you have a valid user. If we don't, we can send a 401. And then if we have a valid user, we'll generate a JSON Web Token. So in this case, I'm using this library where I just basically pass it the payload that I want to put into my JSON Web Token. I'll give it a secret key, in this case, my super secret. And I'll just specify options like this one will expire in 10 minutes. And then I'll redirect the users to a callback URL. And I'll show you the callback URL in a few minutes. But basically, it's the URL that you want the users to be redirected after they're authenticated. So I redirect the users there, and I'll append the access token as part of the hash part of my URL here. And then I can start my server. So my authorization server in my demos will be working on port 8080. Now I also need an API. I need some resources to access. And I'll do the same type of thing. So I'll have Express body parser. I'll use randopeep here, which is just a random stuff generator. And I'll have two different routes on my API. So one public and one that is protected. And randopeep will generate me random clickbait headlines. So I'll use this library, and I'll use Express JWT, which is a middleware that basically does that. It decodes the JSON Web Token, ensures that it's a valid one. So like I said, if you want to implement your APIs, or if you want to protect your APIs, try to find a library that does that stuff for you. And then you start Express. JWCheck or Express JWT is very easy to configure. You just pass it the secret key as well as the different things that you want to validate on. As I've mentioned, you probably want to validate who's the issuer of this token, which would have been specified in the authorization server, the audience who is this token meant for, which is this API. So there's a few things that you want and you can validate here. In this case, I'll just validate that the secret key is actually matching the one on the authorization server. So your secret key should only be shared between your API and your authorization server. Your front end should never have to have access to your secret key, because then that would expose the secret key to anyone, and then anybody would be able to generate new JSON Web Tokens. So for this API, I'll have just a route that returns me randomly generated clickbait headlines. And I'll have another protected route that will send me randomly generated clickbait headlines featuring yours truly. We'll see how that goes. Now, those two are very similar. The only difference here is that I'm using the middleware for that specific call. So Express makes it very, very easy to use middleware. So it will actually check the request. It will check if there's a valid JSON Web Token as part of the request. and will throw an error if there's no valid tokens found. And then you have your catch-all, and we'll start an API on port 8888. Now for a front end, the only thing that we need to do is to actually add the access token as part of our headers. So we'll add a new header that is authorization, and in this case, I'll use a bearer token. So I'll just say bearer, and I pass it the access token. So really, that's all you need to do on your front-end side. So let's look at how this looks like. All right, where is it? Nope. There it is. You'll see a theme there. Does everyone know HTTP cats? It's like just a library that returns you a status code with an image of a cat. Oh. Okay. So I have my application here, and basically what it does is just access those two different routes on the API, and will just display the message that I get back from the server here. So if I try to get my public APIs or my randomly generated clickbait headlines, I can get it because they're not protected. They're not protected by a JSON Web Token. I'm never sure if this is going to be like safe for work or not. Oh, okay, it's not too bad. So I can actually get the answer back from the server. Now, if I try to access the protected route, I'm getting a message. I'm getting a 401 because I don't have an access token. I didn't pass the access token as part of my request, so I'm getting an error that says no authorization token was found. So that's good. That works. So now if you log in, you'll note that this might be a little bit small, but the URL completely changed. So I'm now accessing the authorization server, and the authorization server is serving me a login form. Not the most elaborate one, but anyways. Also, I specified here the callback URL. So I'm telling the authorization server, once you're done, once the user is actually validated, redirect back to localhost port 5000, which is where I had the application. So now if you remember, I started by validating the request. So if I don't have a username and password, we'll get a message that says no username and password. So it's not a valid request. And it's a cute cat. All right. If I do try to enter, so I don't even protect my fields with a password field here. So if I don't have the right username and password, I'm getting a 401. Do you want me to zoom on it? No. All right. And let me just fix that password here. All right. So once I have the right username and password, I'm simply redirected back to my application. And as you can see, as part of my URL, now I have this hash access token, and I have the actual access token here. All right, so you're sending back that access token to your URL. Normally, you would try to remove that part from the URL, but for demo purposes, I left it there. Now, if I take this, I can go JWTIO and just paste it in, and I have all of the information that is part of my JSON Web Token. So like I said, make sure that you never put any sensitive information there, because anyone that can actually access your access token can actually see all of the content. All right, so that works. So now I have an access token. So in theory, I can click on awesome headline, and I'm getting a randomly generated clickbait headline featuring yours truly. All right, that was not politically correct. All right. Okay. So it's all about delegation, right? So it's all about passing the puck. Is that too much of a Canadian expression, or is that good? Although you guys play way better hockey than we do, apparently. All right, so it's all about delegation, delegating access to resources, as well as delegating the stuff that is related to users to an actual server that takes care of that, and making sure that you have the right teams on working on those resources. I hate everything that has to do with security, so I don't want to deal with that stuff. So I can actually delegate all of that to the security team, They make sure that everything is secure and I don't have to care about it. So that takes care of one part of it. So let me just come back to my frequent travel. As I travel, I have to go to hotels, obviously, and I usually try to avoid places like this. Those hotels that let you sign a guest book like by hand and just say, yeah, my name is John Smith. Yeah, I'll try to avoid those places. I won't necessarily go to super high-end places, but places like this, like here, one thing that they will do is that they'll actually ask you for a piece of ID, just in case you like trash the whole room or anything. They want to be able to find you. When I travel, I always have my passport with me, obviously, but a passport is a very, very sensitive piece of information. I don't want to share that with anyone. If somebody would get a hold of that, they could tamper with my password, they could play with it, and that would prevent me to go back to Canada, which is not too bad when I'm in Germany, but if I'm in the US, I really want to go back. So, are there any Americans in the room? Yeah, there's one. Sorry. But that's fine. You live in Sweden now, so. Another piece of ID that we have in Canada, which is probably one of the most important piece of ID that we have, is the social security number, social insurance number, which is the number that you use for your employer so that you can pay taxes and all that fun stuff. But obviously, that will never be accepted anywhere because it doesn't contain any information. It only has a number and a name. It doesn't prove who I am. So the one piece of information, or the one ID that I will typically use, and that's really funny because it's my driver's license, and it's actually in French. But still, it will be accepted just about anywhere in the world because there's a lot of features there. There's my picture. Well, not my picture, but there's a picture. There's a name, date of birth, address, a lot of information. There's also a lot of things like if you twist it, there's like holograms in it. There's like government logos. It kind of looks legit. There's also barcodes. There's a phone number where you can call to validate if this is actually a valid driver's license or not. So there's a lot of things that you can use to validate if this is a real piece of ID or not. There's also a lot of information about the owner of the card, the address, the picture, like I said, the name, as well as a lot of different permissions. So I'm allowed to drive a car, but not a semi-truck. I need to wear my glasses, but to drive, and all those different things. And that's what OpenID Connect does in the world of web. So OpenID Connect is built on top of OAuth 2. So it's just an extra layer on top of it. And there's multiple, they tried to do a few things before OpenID Connect came out. So they tried to have this like unified username for the whole internet, which was the first OpenID initiative. But for some reason, Facebook and Google did not want to share all the information they had about the users. They wanted to keep collecting the information. So it never got a lot of traction. With OpenID Connect, it's completely different. It's just an extra layer on top of OAuth. And what it does basically is that it simply provides you with an identity token in the format of a JWT. So in this case, it has to be JSON Web Tokens to be compliant with the standard. And the only thing that it does really is that it uses the /userinfo endpoint to provide you with some information about the user. So in order to access the information about the user, when you have an OpenID Connect server, you will simply add a new scope, and you'll say, I want the OpenID information, and you can specify different things that you want. There's a lot of things that are defined in the standard, stuff like profile, email, and so on. So if we go back to our flow, basically the only difference is that you will add the scope variable as part of your request, and it will return you the access code and all that stuff. But then the server can make an extra request to get an identity token from the server. If you're interested in looking at all the flow, and that's a website that I've looked at really helped me to understand what was going on in all the different redirects. So I encourage you to take a look at this. But just very quickly, still have a few minutes, so let me just go here. complete disclosure, I'll use auth0, but you could use any other server. You could use Curity. Why? Have you noticed the new update will not let you click shift down to get the rest of the URL? Anyways. So now if I try to log in, once again, I'm redirected to an authorization server. And one nice thing when you start using open standards like that is that you can fairly easily switch from one authorization server to another one. Now the response that I'm getting is an access token, but I'm also getting an ID token. And once again, let me just go to JWT.io, and I can actually see all of the information about the user. So I've logged in with Google, so I got all of that information from the user. I have his name, family name, gender, locale, picture. There's a lot of stuff, and that's because I've been using Google Server. Of course, if you built your own implementation, you could decide whatever information you want to share there. But if you build an application and you don't want to build your own authorization server, then it's a nice way to actually get a lot of information about your users without going through the process of asking, like putting up a form, asking him to upload an image and doing all that stuff. You can actually use everything from Google or Facebook or whatever service that you're actually using. All right. So like I said, OAuth is a lot about delegation. Once again, access to the resources, giving different actors access to different resources so that they can do things on your behalf. But it's also about delegating the work to people that actually care. So if you're a backend developer, you want to focus on your APIs, you want to focus on that stuff, you can actually take care of only and exclusively the access to resource, making sure that all the business logic is in there. If you're a front-end developer, you can actually focus all of your efforts on the front end, making sure everything looks pretty, everything works. But you don't have to be bothered with all of the security stuff that you need to implement. You can actually delegate all of that stuff to either your own team of security experts or delegating that to another server that can take care of all of this for you. So you could use Facebook servers, Twitter servers, Google servers, doesn't matter. But you can delegate all of that responsibility to them instead of taking care of that by yourself. So that's all I had. So I still have about 10 minutes for questions. If there's any questions, there's a few.
What you have done basically in JWT token, you have put in the scope the access rights, whatever, so that whenever someone opens the browser inspector, they can see access rights, whatever. Would you do that actually in applications? Because what we have done basically, we exhibited an extra validate call so that the JWT token includes nothing but the ID, basically the subject. And that the API then fetches later on the access rights just with additional validate call. Of course, you have then more traffic, but in the browser, you don't see anything about the user. Yes.
So about the permissions in the scope, yes, I did it just about the worst way you could do it, where I just expose all of that stuff. All of the access control, as far as I know, is not defined as part of the standard. It's really up to your own implementation. You could do it the way that you want. And once again, I'll go back to what I said earlier, is that, it's always a range of how secure you want things to be and so on. Maybe it doesn't matter if somebody gets a hold and can see what the user has access to, or, maybe it doesn't really matter. So maybe you could use that, but it makes sense to hide it in some different scenarios as well. So it's not defined anywhere, so there's no right or wrong answer. But it's totally up to you in the implementation and trying to figure out how you want to secure your applications. There's another question in front?
One question, maybe you explained it, I just didn't understand. This user info, and there's this user info endpoint that you talk about, but whenever I played around with OpenID Connect a little bit, and when I request a token, I always get the ID token back, and it already has all the information.
Yes.
So why do I need this extra endpoint?
It's built in, so you can get more information if you need to. But typically what happens is that it gets the information already for you, so it just sends you back the ID token as part of your request. Mm-hmm. So you don't see that process, but it uses that type of thing internally inside, like on the authorization server. Does that make sense? Yeah. There's another question in the back? Refresh tokens is something that, quite frankly, I haven't played a lot with. There are best practices in place. Most of the time, I focus on simple single-page applications, so I don't use refresh tokens as much. So I'd like to have a really good answer and a very clever answer for you, but I don't. So I think a lot of the servers will actually just store them in the database, and because they can be revoked, it's probably don't have to hide them that much. Well, just not more than anything else. But I might be completely wrong here. Yeah, but that's the best answer I can give you. Yeah, but it's also the reason why, if you were following the Node stuff going on, recently NPM released that they had a breach, and some of the refresh tokens were part of the logs, and somebody got a hold of the logs, so they recommended, or they revoked, I think, they revoked all of the refresh tokens on their servers. So they actually did it so that you had to relog in the next time. But that was because they were stored in a more or less non-secure way. So make sure that you don't put them in your logs at least. But yeah.
Comment on that?
Yes, please.
Start every node with the same shared key, and I would use that key to do an AES encryption and store the AES encrypted value in the database, because then it will be very fast to do.
Okay, thank you. All right. I'll take more questions if you want to come and see me and talk afterwards. I just don't want to keep everybody in the room. So I'm easy to find. I have like a super bright red hoodie, and I'm still here for a few minutes. So come and see me if you'd like. So thank you very much for attending.